The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty driveway of Pine Grove Farm as Susan Chen wiped the sweat from her brow. At 42, she had the weathered hands of someone who knew real work, and the steady gaze of someone who had seen far more than the peaceful countryside around her. The farm had been her sanctuary for the past 3 years since returning from her final tour as a combat medic, a chapter of her life she rarely discussed with her new neighbors. The familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance made her pause as she loaded hay bales onto her old pickup truck. Usually, the rural roads leading to her farm were quiet, save for the occasional tractor or delivery vehicle. But today was different. The sound grew louder, and soon a group of 8 bikers appeared, their machines gleaming in the morning light as they pulled into her driveway. Susan straightened her worn denim jacket and watched them approach, her face neutral but her mind already assessing the situation, an old habit from her military days. The bikers, dressed in leather vests and worn jeans, dismounted their motorcycles with an air of arrogance that made her cattle dog, Rex, bristle beside her. "Nice little setup you got here," called out their leader, a tall man with a graying beard and sunglasses. His tone carried a hint of mockery that Susan had learned to recognize all too well during her years of service. "Must be hard for a lady like yourself to manage all alone." The other bikers snickered, spreading out across her driveway in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Susan remained silent, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her mind was already mapping escape routes and calculating distances, another habit she'd never quite shaken. "We're looking to set up a little weekend gathering," the leader continued, taking off his sunglasses to reveal cold eyes. "This property would be perfect. Lots of space, nice and private." He paused, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We're willing to pay, of course. Though I doubt you're making much from this." He gestured dismissively at her carefully tended fields, "whatever this is." Susan took a slow breath, remembering similar moments of tension in far more dangerous places. She'd treated wounded soldiers under heavy fire, stabilized civilians in war-torn villages, and faced down threats that made these bikers look like schoolyard bullies. But here, on her own land, she felt a different kind of strength. "This is a working farm," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Not a party venue. I'm afraid you'll have to look elsewhere." She noticed 2 of the bikers exchanging glances, slowly moving to flank her. Rex growled low in his throat, picking up on the mounting tension. The leader's fake smile vanished. "Look, lady, maybe you don't understand how things work around here. We've taken a liking to this place, and we're trying to be nice about it. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to your pretty little farm, would we?" Susan felt a familiar clarity settle over her, the same focus that had guided her through countless emergencies in the field. These men saw what they wanted to see, a middle-aged woman alone on a farm. They had no way of knowing about the years she'd spent in combat zones, the lives she'd saved under fire, or the steel that such experiences had forged in her. "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had once directed medical evacuations under enemy fire. "And I think you gentlemen need to understand something too." She took a step forward, causing Rex to move with her, his protective instincts matching her confidence. "This isn't just any farm, and I'm not just any farmer." The sudden shift in her demeanor made several of the bikers step back involuntarily. There was something in her stance, in the way she held herself, that spoke of capabilities far beyond tending crops and raising livestock. The leader's face darkened with anger, but uncertainty had crept into his expression. "Is that a threat?" he demanded, trying to maintain his intimidating facade. But Susan could see the doubt growing in his eyes as she remained perfectly still, unfazed by his attempts at intimidation. "No," she answered calmly. "It's a fact. One that your friend there seems to recognize." She nodded toward one of the younger bikers who had been hanging back, his face showing a growing recognition. Susan had noticed his military bearing the moment they arrived, and now she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "Hey, boss," the young biker called out, his voice tight with sudden respect. "Check out that metal case in the window behind her." The leader turned, finally noticing the display of military honors visible through the farmhouse window. "That's a combat medical badge. And unless I'm mistaken, those are service medals from multiple tours." The atmosphere shifted palpably as the implications sank in. Susan watched as the realization spread through the group. They hadn't just stumbled upon an easy target. They'd wandered into the home of someone who had faced far worse threats than a group of intimidating bikers. "This is your last chance to leave peacefully," Susan stated, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had made similar declarations under far more dangerous circumstances. "I'd prefer not to have to demonstrate exactly why threatening a combat medic on her own property is a bad idea." The leader looked from Susan to the metal case and back again, his bravado crumbling in the face of this unexpected revelation. The menacing atmosphere he'd tried to create had evaporated, replaced by a tense uncertainty that left his followers shifting uncomfortably on their feet. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, the leader put his sunglasses back on and gestured to his companions. One by one, they backed away, returning to their motorcycles with far less swagger than they'd shown upon arrival. The roar of engines filled the air once more, but this time in retreat, leaving only dust clouds and wounded pride in their wake. As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, Susan felt her combat-ready tension slowly ease. Rex relaxed beside her, looking up with devoted eyes as she scratched behind his ears. "Good boy," she murmured, both to him and to herself. Some battles were won without a single blow being struck, and some strengths ran far deeper than surface appearances suggested. The encounter with the bikers had stirred something in Susan that she'd tried to leave behind. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, her mind drifted back to her time in service. Rex lay at her feet, his presence a constant comfort in moments like these when memories surfaced uninvited. A motorcycle's distant rumble made her tense momentarily, but this engine sounded different, solitary and hesitant. As the bike came into view, she recognized the young biker from earlier, the one who'd identified her military credentials. He rode slowly up her driveway, alone this time, his body language entirely different from the morning's confrontation. He parked his bike at a respectful distance and removed his helmet, revealing a face that couldn't have been more than 30. "Ma'am," he called out, staying by his motorcycle. "I was hoping I could have a word with you. I served too, Afghanistan, 2019. Susan studied him for a moment before nodding. "Come on up to the porch. There's fresh lemonade in the pitcher." She watched as he climbed the steps, noting the slight favor he gave his left leg, an injury, probably, though well healed. "I'm Danny," he said, accepting the glass she offered. "I wanted to apologize for this morning. I didn't know who you were when we rode in, and by the time I figured it out." He trailed off, shame evident in his expression. "You're not riding with them anymore, I take it?" Susan asked, though she already knew the answer from his solitary arrival. Danny shook his head. "No, ma'am. After what happened here, well, let's just say it brought back some things I've been trying to forget. Made me realize I've been running with the wrong crowd since getting back." Susan understood all too well. She'd seen many veterans struggle to find their place after returning home. Some found peace in nature, like she had with her farm. Others sought the adrenaline and brotherhood they'd known in service, sometimes finding it in all the wrong places. "First tour?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of lemonade. "First and only. Got hit by an IED outside Kandahar. Your unit might have been the one that patched me up, I don't remember much from that day." He took a sip of lemonade, his eyes distant. "They told me later that a combat medic kept me alive until the chopper arrived." Susan felt her throat tighten. She'd treated so many young soldiers, their faces blending together in her memories. I was stationed there in 2019, she said quietly. Base Hospital Charlie. Danny's eyes widened. Charlie? Then you were definitely there. I owe you people my life. He set his glass down, hands trembling slightly. Makes what happened this morning even worse. What matters is what you do next, Susan replied, her voice gentle but firm. The past is the past, whether it's this morning or Kandahar. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills. Finally, Danny spoke again. I've been thinking about getting back into emergency medicine. I was a combat lifesaver in my unit, and lately I've been feeling like maybe that's what I should be doing instead of running with guys like Jack and his crew. Susan nodded, understanding the pull of returning to something meaningful. The local volunteer fire department is always looking for trained medics, she offered. They could use someone with your experience. For the first time since his arrival, Danny smiled, a genuine expression that made him look his age. You think they'd take a chance on someone like me? They took a chance on me when I first moved here, Susan replied, standing up to refill their glasses. I'm actually headed there tomorrow morning to help with their training session. You're welcome to come along. As the evening settled around them, they continued talking, about service, about healing, about finding purpose in civilian life. When Danny finally left, his motorcycle's rumble was accompanied by the sound of hope, of a new direction taking shape. Susan watched until his taillights disappeared into the darkness. Some battles were won with courage, others with compassion. Today had brought both kinds of victory, and as she headed inside with Rex at her heels, she felt more at peace than she had in months. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Susan's pickup truck rumbled down the country roads toward the volunteer fire department. Danny followed on his motorcycle, having arrived at her farm exactly when promised. The morning light caught the dew on the surrounding fields, creating a peaceful scene that belied the intensity of the training day ahead. The fire station was a modest brick building with 2 bay doors and a small training yard out back. As they pulled in, Susan noticed several familiar faces among the volunteers gathering for the morning briefing. The fire chief, a sturdy man in his 50s who everyone called Pop, broke into a warm smile when he saw Susan. His expression turned curious at the sight of Danny parking his motorcycle. "Morning, Susan," Pop called out, walking over to greet them. "This must be the combat lifesaver you mentioned?" Before either could respond, the station's alarm system blared to life. Pop's radio crackled with urgent information: a major accident on Route 27, multiple vehicles involved, including a school bus. Susan and Danny exchanged quick glances, their military training kicking in instantaneously. "We're short-staffed today," Pop announced, looking at Susan and Danny. "I know you're here for training, but..." "We're coming," Susan cut in, already moving toward the emergency vehicle. Danny fell in step beside her, his earlier nervousness replaced by focused determination. The scene they arrived at was chaotic but familiar to both veterans. A semi-truck had jackknifed across the highway, causing a chain reaction. The school bus, thankfully only carrying the driver and 2 students at this early hour, had swerved to avoid the truck and rolled onto its side. 3 other vehicles were involved, with various degrees of damage. Susan took charge of the medical response naturally, her combat experience enabling her to quickly triage the situation. "Danny, take the bus," she directed. "I'll handle the pickup truck with the trapped driver. Pop, your team can manage the walking wounded from the other vehicles." Danny moved with practiced efficiency toward the bus, his military training evident in every step. Through the radio, Susan heard his calm voice reporting the status of the bus occupants. The driver was conscious with minor injuries, 1 student had a possible broken arm, the other appeared shaken but unhurt. Meanwhile, Susan worked methodically to stabilize the pickup truck's driver, an elderly man who was pinned behind his steering wheel. The situation eerily echoed a vehicle extraction she'd performed in a combat zone, but this time the sounds of gunfire were replaced by the reassuring sirens of approaching backup. "Stay with me, sir," she encouraged, monitoring his vital signs while the fire team worked to free him. "My name's Susan, and I'm going to make sure you get through this." The man's eyes focused on hers, drawing strength from her confident presence. Across the scene, Danny's voice remained steady on the radio as he coordinated with the incoming ambulance team. His previous uncertainty had vanished, replaced by the capable medical provider he'd been trained to be. The transformation was remarkable. This was the same young man who, just yesterday, had been running with a biker gang. As additional emergency services arrived, Susan and Danny worked seamlessly with the local teams, their military experience proving invaluable in maintaining order amid the chaos. Their efficient cooperation helped ensure all victims were stabilized and transported to nearby hospitals within the critical first hour. After the last ambulance departed, Pop gathered everyone for a quick debrief. "I've been running this department for 15 years, he began, looking at Susan and Danny with undisguised admiration, "and I've never seen a smoother response to a mass casualty incident. You two worked like you'd been doing this together for years." Danny stood a little straighter at the praise, his eyes bright with renewed purpose. Susan noticed how the other volunteers were looking at him with respect, seeing not an ex-biker but a skilled medical professional. "The training session's technically cancelled," Pop continued, "but I'd say we got something better, a real-world demonstration of emergency response at its finest." He turned to Danny. "Son, if you're interested, we could use someone with your skills on our team. Permanently." The look of pride and belonging on Danny's face reminded Susan of her own journey, how this community had helped her find her footing after leaving the service. Sometimes the path to healing meant using old skills in new ways, helping others while helping yourself. As they headed back to their vehicles, Danny caught Susan's eye. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything." Susan nodded, understanding all the layers of gratitude in those two words. Sometimes the biggest battles weren't fought with weapons but with the choice to start over, to become the person you were meant to be all along. Word of Susan and Danny's heroics at the accident scene spread quickly through the small community. By evening, the local diner was buzzing with eyewitness accounts of how the farmer-turned-combat medic and the former biker had saved lives. But Susan wasn't there to hear any of it. She was back at her farm, tending to her evening chores as if it had been just another day. The sound of approaching vehicles made her look up from feeding the chickens. This time, instead of motorcycles, she saw a procession of cars pulling into her driveway. Leading them was a modest sedan driven by Mrs. Thompson, the mother of one of the students from the school bus accident. Susan wiped her hands on her jeans as the visitors emerged from their vehicles. Mrs. Thompson rushed forward, tears in her eyes, pulling Susan into an unexpected hug. "My Amy told me everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How you and that young man handled the whole situation, how you kept everyone calm, how you knew exactly what to do." Behind Mrs. Thompson stood the elderly man Susan had helped free from the pickup truck, now supported by his adult daughter. His arm was in a sling, but his eyes were clear and grateful. More people gathered, family members of those involved in the accident, neighbors who had heard the story, even Pop from the fire department. "We didn't know," said the elderly man's daughter, stepping forward. "All this time, we just thought of you as the quiet farmer who kept to herself. We had no idea what you'd been through, what you were capable of." Susan shifted uncomfortably under the attention. "Anyone with the training would have done the same," she replied, but Pop shook his head. "That's not true, and you know it," he said firmly. "What you and Danny did today, that wasn't just training. That was something special." As if summoned by his name, the rumble of Danny's motorcycle approached. He pulled up to the gathering, looking surprised at the crowd. Susan noticed he was wearing a new volunteer firefighter jacket, and his bike had been cleaned of its gang insignias. "Sorry I'm late," he called out, walking up to join them. Had to finish my paperwork at the station. He glanced at Susan with a smile. Official now. Pop fast-tracked my application. Mrs. Thompson turned to include Danny in her gratitude. Both of you, she said, looking between them. You're both such a blessing to this community. The elderly man stepped forward carefully. My daughter and I have been talking, he said. We own the old Miller property next to the fire station. It's been sitting empty since Joe Miller passed. We'd like to donate it to the department, specifically for a training center. He looked at Susan. And we'd be honored if you'd consider running it. The proposal caught Susan off guard. She looked at Pop, who was grinning broadly. We've been wanting to expand our medical training program, he said. Who better to lead it than someone who's saved lives both in combat and right here at home? Danny stepped closer to Susan. You helped me find my way back, he said quietly. Think how many others you could help. Susan looked around at the faces before her, no longer strangers or just neighbors, but a community that had somehow become her new unit, her new mission. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd bought the farm, seeking solitude and peace. But perhaps this was something better. I'll need to hire someone to help with the farm, she said slowly. Can't let the training center take up all my time. Already solved, Pop replied with a chuckle. Half the high school kids have been begging for summer jobs since they heard about what happened today. You've got your pick of eager helpers. As the group broke into excited discussion about plans for the training center, Susan felt something settle in her chest, a feeling of rightness, of purpose found. Danny caught her eye and nodded, understanding written across his face. They had both been looking for a way to use their skills, to honor their past while building a future. Later, after the impromptu gathering had dispersed and the evening shadows were lengthening across her fields, Susan sat on her porch with Rex at her feet. Danny had stayed behind, working on his bike in her barn, the rhythmic sounds of tools mixing with the evening birdsong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, paperwork for the training center, farm chores, perhaps even another emergency call. But for now, Susan savored the quiet moment, reflecting on how life had a way of coming full circle. She had come here seeking escape, only to find that what she really needed was connection, to this land, to this community, to the skills that had shaped her. 3 months after the highway accident, the old Miller property had transformed into a bustling training center. The worn-down building now sported fresh paint and new equipment, while the surrounding grounds hosted regular emergency response drills. Susan split her time between the farm, where local teenagers eagerly helped with chores, and the center, where she found herself teaching more than just medical skills. One humid afternoon, as Susan demonstrated wound-packing techniques to a group of volunteers, Danny burst into the training room. His face was tense with urgency. Susan, we've got trouble. Jack's crew is back, and they've got someone hurt bad. The name sent a ripple through the room. Everyone knew about the biker gang that had once threatened Susan's farm. But now they were back, not with threats, but seeking help. Where? Susan asked, already moving toward her medical kit. The old quarry road, Danny replied, matching her stride. One of their new members took a bad turn. They called the emergency line, but when they heard who was responding. He paused. They specifically asked for you. Susan nodded, understanding the complex dynamics at play. Tell Pop we're heading out. And Danny? She caught his eye. You okay with this? His jaw tightened, but he nodded. There's still people who need help. You taught me that. They arrived at the quarry road to find a scene painfully familiar to both veterans, a young rider down, his friends hovering helplessly nearby. Jack, the gang leader who had once threatened Susan's farm, stood apart from the group, his usual swagger replaced by evident concern. Susan approached the injured rider with calm professionalism, her combat medic training taking over. The young man had suffered a serious leg injury, with concerning blood loss. As she worked, she noticed his military tattoo, another veteran, like so many others drawn to the false promise of brotherhood in gangs. "I served too," the injured rider managed through gritted teeth, his eyes finding the combat medic patch on Susan's jacket. "Afghanistan?" she asked, efficiently applying a pressure dressing. "Iraq," he gasped. "Fallujah." Jack watched the exchange, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. But Susan noticed how he tensed when Danny approached with additional supplies, shame and recognition warring on his face. As they stabilized the rider for transport, Susan made a decision. "You know," she said, loud enough for all to hear, "we're always looking for experienced people at the training center. Combat veterans especially. They understand what it means to work under pressure." The injured rider's eyes widened slightly, while several of the other bikers shifted uncomfortably. Jack removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had lost their previous coldness. "Heard about what you've been doing here," he said gruffly. "Danny, he seems to have found his place." "There's room for more," Danny replied, his voice steady as he helped secure the injured rider for transport. "Some of us just need a different kind of brotherhood." The arrival of the ambulance paused the conversation, but Susan could see the seeds of change had been planted. As the injured rider was loaded for transport, several of the younger bikers lingered, asking questions about the training center, about volunteer opportunities, about finding a purpose that didn't require proving themselves through intimidation. Back at the center that evening, Susan and Danny sat in her office, processing the day's events. The walls around them displayed photos of training sessions, certificates, and a growing collection of thank you notes from the community. "You knew, didn't you?" Danny asked. "That they'd come around eventually?" Susan smiled, thinking of her own journey. Sometimes people just need to be shown a different path. Especially those of us who've seen war. We come back looking for that same sense of purpose, of belonging. Some find it in gangs, others in isolation. She gestured around the room. But this, helping others, teaching, being part of something bigger than ourselves, this is what we were really looking for. A knock at the door interrupted them. Pop stood there, holding a stack of applications. "You're not going to believe this," he said, grinning. 3 of Jack's riders just dropped these off. They want to join the volunteer program." Danny laughed, shaking his head in amazement. "Life's funny sometimes, isn't it? 3 months ago, they were trying to intimidate you. Now they want to learn from you." Susan took the applications, thinking about how a single moment could change everything, a chance encounter, a crisis, a choice to help instead of harm. The training center had become more than just a place to learn medical skills. It was becoming a sanctuary for lost warriors finding their way home. 6 months into running the training center, Susan stood before a transformed group of students. Former bikers now sat alongside local volunteers, all focused intently on her lesson about trauma response. The change in the ex-gang members was striking. Their leather jackets now bore emergency responder patches instead of gang insignias, and their faces showed purpose rather than aggression. Jack, who had finally joined the program himself, was proving to be an unexpectedly dedicated student. His natural leadership abilities, once used to intimidate, now helped organize training sessions and coordinate emergency responses. Though the memories of their first encounter still lingered, Susan had come to see it as the catalyst that had brought them all to this point. That afternoon's training session was interrupted by an urgent call. A massive storm was approaching the county, and emergency services needed all hands on deck. Susan watched with pride as her diverse group of trainees mobilized without hesitation, former bikers and local volunteers moving as one cohesive unit. "Never thought I'd be on this side of an emergency," Jack commented as they loaded supplies into response vehicles. "Used to be the one causing trouble, not helping with it." Danny, now a full-time instructor at the center, overheard and smiled. "Funny how life works out. Remember when you guys thought this was just some weak farm woman's place?" The approaching storm brought winds that bent trees sideways and rain that fell in sheets. Reports of flooding and stranded families started pouring in. Susan's team split into groups, their training put to the ultimate test as they worked alongside official emergency services. Jack and his former gang members proved invaluable. Their knowledge of back roads and experience riding in tough conditions helped them reach areas that larger emergency vehicles couldn't access. They worked tirelessly through the night, evacuating elderly residents, reinforcing flood barriers, and providing emergency medical care where needed. In one particularly tense moment, Jack and Susan found themselves working together to rescue a family trapped in a partially flooded house. As they helped the last child into the rescue boat, Jack turned to Susan with newfound respect in his eyes. "You know what's crazy," he said, rain streaming down his face. "If you had just been what we thought you were that first day, just some easy target, none of this would be happening. All these lives we're helping to save, it all started because you stood your ground and showed us a better way." Susan gripped his shoulder, the gesture bridging their past and present. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best ones," she replied, thinking of her own journey from combat zones to this moment. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a community even more tightly knit than before. The training center had proved its worth beyond anyone's expectations, and the sight of former bikers working alongside longtime residents became a symbol of how people could change when given the chance. At a community meeting a week after the storm, Pop stood before a packed room. "What we've seen here," he announced, "is something special. This training center, started because of one woman's courage and another man's choice to change, has become something none of us could have imagined." He gestured to Susan and her team. "We've got veterans finding purpose, young people learning life-saving skills, and former rivals working together to protect our community. The county board has noticed, and they want to use our center as a model for other communities." Susan looked around the room at her unlikely family, Danny standing tall and proud, Jack and his former gang members sitting respectfully in their new roles, local volunteers who had overcome their initial prejudices, and farmhands who had become emergency responders. Each face told a story of transformation, of lives redirected toward something meaningful. The threatening encounter that had started it all now seemed like a lifetime ago. In its place stood a testament to the power of second chances and the strength of a community that had learned to look past appearances to see the potential in everyone. 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, Susan stood in her farmhouse kitchen, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky. The sound of motorcycles approaching no longer made her tense. These days, it usually meant students arriving for early morning training sessions. Today was special, the first graduation ceremony for the training center's inaugural class. The old Miller property, once abandoned, now bustled with activity as volunteers set up chairs and a small stage in the parking lot. Susan smiled at the sight of Jack directing traffic, his commanding presence now used to organize rather than intimidate. Danny appeared at her door, wearing a pressed instructor's uniform. "Got something to show you," he said, excitement evident in his voice. He handed her a letter bearing an official government seal. "The VA wants to partner with us. They want to make this a pilot program for veteran rehabilitation across the state." Susan read the letter, her hands trembling slightly. What had started as a local emergency response training center had grown into something far bigger. Veterans from neighboring counties had begun showing up, drawn by word of mouth about a place where their skills were valued and their struggles understood. "There's more," Danny continued. "Remember that kid from the school bus accident? Amy? She's applying to medical school. Says we inspired her." He paused, watching as more motorcycles pulled into the lot, not just their regular students, but riders from other towns, some wearing patches from different organizations. Words getting around. "We're changing lives, Susan." The graduation ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Pop served as master of ceremonies, his weathered face beaming with pride as he called each graduate forward. The crowd was an unusual mix, families with children, elderly community members, and leather-clad bikers all sitting together, united by their connection to the center. When Jack walked across the stage to receive his certification, he stopped and turned to address the crowd. "Year ago, I led a group of men to this town, thinking we could throw our weight around, take what we wanted." His voice carried across the hushed audience. "Instead, we found something we needed more than we knew: purpose, respect, community. Real brotherhood, not the kind we were pretending to have." He looked at Susan, his eyes sincere. "This woman could have had us arrested that day. Instead, she showed us another way. Some of you might know me as the guy who tried to intimidate the farm woman. Now you know me as one of her instructors, teaching others what she taught us." The ceremony continued, each graduate adding their own story to the tapestry of transformation. Former gang members spoke of finding legitimate brotherhood in service to others. Local teenagers described discovering their calling in emergency medicine. Veterans talked about finally feeling at home again. After the ceremonies, as the sun began to set, Susan found herself back on her porch, this time surrounded by her unlikely family. Danny was showing a group of visiting veterans around, while Jack helped Pop pack up the chairs. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air where once there had been tension and threats. "Got a call from the next county over," Pop mentioned, joining Susan on the porch. "They're sending their emergency response teams for training next month. Your program's becoming famous." Susan watched as a new group of motorcycles pulled in, more veterans who had heard about the center. Among them was the young rider who had been injured on the quarry road, now walking proudly with only a slight limp, wearing an emergency responder patch on his jacket. "You know what I see when I look out there," she said to Pop, gesturing at the gathering. "I see what we all brought back from our service: leadership, courage, the desire to help others. Sometimes we just need a reminder of who we really are." A young woman approached the porch, Amy, the student from the bus accident, now a high school graduate preparing for pre-med studies. "Ms. Chen, I wanted to thank you for everything. You showed us that one person really can change things." Susan thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment, how a threatening encounter had transformed into a movement of healing and purpose. The farm was still her sanctuary, but now it was also something more, a beacon for others finding their way home from their own battles. As the evening wound down, the sound of motorcycles filled the air again, not in intimidation, but in celebration. Each departing rider carried with them not just a certification, but a piece of the miracle that had happened here. The story of how a combat medic's stand against intimidation had become a mission of transformation for an entire community. 18 months after the confrontation that had started it all, Susan stood at the edge of her farm, watching the morning mist rise over the expanded training facility. The old Miller property had grown to include a new wing, funded by the VA partnership, specifically designed for veteran rehabilitation programs. But it was what stood in her own farmyard that brought the most satisfaction: a simple memorial garden, created by the community, honoring both fallen soldiers and those finding their way home. The garden had been Jack's idea, surprisingly. A place for remembering, he'd said, but also for healing. Now, early morning sunlight glinted off the small fountain at its center, surrounded by benches where visitors often sat in quiet reflection. The sound of water flowing mingled with birdsong, creating a peaceful backdrop for the day ahead. Danny pulled up in his truck, now bearing the official logo of the training center, a medical caduceus intertwined with a farming motif, symbolizing the unique blend of healing and growth that had become their hallmark. "Got some visitors coming today," he called out, grinning. "You're not going to believe who." Before Susan could ask, the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air. But these weren't their usual students or graduates. Leading the group was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, his leather jacket adorned with combat medals. Behind him rode 24 veterans, each representing different eras of service. "The National Veterans Association," Danny explained. They've been hearing about what we've done here. They want to make it a national program. The lead rider dismounted and removed his helmet, revealing a face Susan hadn't seen in 15 years, her former commanding officer from her first deployment. "Colonel Richards," she breathed, surprised. "Not Colonel anymore," he said warmly, embracing her. "Just another veteran trying to make a difference. When I heard about this place, about what you've built here, I had to see it for myself." He looked around at the thriving facility. "Though I have to admit, the story about how it started, a combat medic facing down a biker gang? That got my attention." Just then, Jack's motorcycle roared up, followed by several of his former gang members, now all wearing instructor uniforms. The contrast between their arrival now and their first threatening appearance couldn't have been more striking. They parked their bikes and immediately began helping with the day's setup, moving with the discipline and purpose they'd found through their transformation. "See that?" Richard said, watching them work. "That's what we need, a way to help veterans find their footing, their purpose. And not just veterans. This community integration you've achieved, it's remarkable." Susan led him through the facility, showing him how they'd combined emergency response training with veteran support services. They passed classrooms where former adversaries now taught side by side, and therapy rooms where veterans helped other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. The tour ended in the Memorial Garden, where early morning classes often began with moments of reflection. "You know what makes this place special?" Susan said, sitting on one of the benches. "It's not just about teaching medical skills or emergency response. It's about healing, all kinds of healing." Richards nodded, understanding. "You've created something unique here, Susan. A place where people can transform their lives, whether they're veterans struggling to find their place or civilians looking to make a difference." He paused, watching as more students arrived for the day's training. "We want to help you expand this model nationwide. Every community could use something like this." As the sun rose fully over the farm, Susan took in the scene before her, Danny leading a morning briefing, Jack organizing the day's training rotations, new students arriving with hope in their eyes, and her former commanding officer planning to share their success with the world. The threatening encounter that had started it all now seemed like a distant memory, transformed into something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. "You know what I've learned," she said finally. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to our true calling." This was never just about standing up to intimidation. It was about standing up for something better, for all of us. The garden's fountain burbled softly, its sound a reminder of how far they'd come and how far they could still go. What had begun as one woman's stand against intimidation had grown into a movement of healing, purpose, and transformation, proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation, but from showing others a better way forward.